Back here at the Private Equity Summit Munich 2021. Well, we have talked a lot about investing money today, and initially it has to be drummed up, has to be raised within fundraising procedures over 12 months, 24 months. And within that process, it's a lot about documentation, apparently. What are the rules under which you raise funds? What are the clauses that will be applied? And we are happy to discuss this today with M.Rostock of Cara Investment, the Frankfurt-based family office, which is pretty much active in real estate, but in private equity as well. So hello, Maria. Thanks for being with us.
Hello. Thank you for the invitation, Thomas.
You are more than welcome. Glad to have you with us. And on the legal end, I mean, me only being a nominal attorney by now cannot say too much about it, but I'm glad that my old acquaintance, A.Aldinger from Arendt and Medernach in Luxembourg, is with us. Adrian, welcome to the show, and you can really help us out because, as we all know, we are a German-based organization which, with French interests going to Boston in September. But when it comes to funds, and I recently held a lecture again with the ePharma figures, it's really about 50%, you know, of the global fund structures, irrespective of the asset class, are US. And then there is one tiny country on this planet with a share of around 10%, and that's Luxembourg, and that's why we're very glad to welcome Adrian. Hello.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks. So why don't we start? We will midways in our panel, we will have a little polling question apparently to ask our audience. And other than that, we want to start now. Maybe, I mean, C19 is a very special environment. Again, the last 15 months facing us with various challenges. So maybe Maria, looking at your desk, what were really the specific C19 initiated changes, accommodations to the documentation on your table?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I would say that I didn't see any changes during the fundraising process because all the funds that were raised in the previous year, the fundraising started basically prior to COVID. And it worked very well with the virtual conferences and telephone calls. So there was no dip in the fundraising process. However, the existing funds, and that was a very interesting thing for us, several funds have asked us to amend the existing LPAs. And I would say the number one amendment was the extension of the investment period, which is definitely explained by the COVID and the investment pace of the corresponding funds. The second amendment was probably the recycling of the returns, so that the GPs asked us to retain the returns and to keep them in the fund and not to provide those returns back to the LPs. And one fund, but I think that was the fund that was actually in the fundraising process during the COVID, they explicitly asked us for warehousing conditions in the LPA. So those were the three strategic changes in the LPAs.
So that's quite interesting. And how did that play out, you know, with regard to the extension that was about the standard period being longer, or just in addition to the 2 times 1 years regularly, 1/3 year extension? How did that play out? To give us
they just asked us for one further vintage, actually, yeah.
Exactly. So, Adrian, looking at your latest fundraising processes and documentations, what were your changes that were regularly asked for?
Well, I would agree with Maria. I think for new funds that are being set up, we don't see a radical change in standard drafting practice. I mean, we do have obviously in our PPMs we do have now new risk factors that a year ago or 1.5 years ago we never would have thought that we needed, but that shows you how quickly times change and things change. We got a lot of questions at the very beginning of the pandemic around how to interpret force majeure clauses, what the established case law around that is. But that is really, not so much reflected in any of the documentation that we now produce. It's really just kind of being able to gauge what potential risks and concerns are. In terms of existing structures, I can agree and confirm that liquidity management issues and access to liquidity was definitely an issue. So we saw a lot of, in addition to these extension of existing funds, we saw alternative vehicles in terms of top-up funds, annex funds, continuation funds, whatever you want to call them, but basically vehicles that allow to invest in existing portfolio companies beyond the existing maturity and the needed maturity to actually become reasonably profitable. So that's certainly a trend that we've seen.
So that's interesting too. I mean, we talked a lot about was kind of a flavor of the last 3 years of GP-led restructuring, right? And that maybe got an additional spin on that end too. Let's talk about a specific topic now, Adrian, the advisory committees, right? So you set up a fund and basically it's the fund manager that has to bring in the returns by means of investing in promising target companies. But then, you oftentimes have cornerstone investors, or maybe it's a second generation fund, right? And you really trust this, large pension fund to re-up with you. So you would a little bit accommodate to those needs, and you will have an advisory committee. And the question is, sometimes, to be honest, it's more, it's not window dressing actually, but maybe it's sometimes not strong enough. It could be really used in a very positive way to influence and to guide, to advise on the investment process. Do you, Adrian, have any, from your experience, some nudges maybe inside the documentation, how to make an LPIC more efficient?
Yeah, I think it's obviously a very tricky question, right? Because certainly investors would want some kind of control rights embedded and guaranteed through these LPACs. The difficulty is that obviously the more involved you get in actual management decisions, the closer you get to taking on responsibility and liability. And so including also from a regulatory perspective, not just from a corporate law perspective. And so you obviously need to strike the right balance between the two in practice. So I think the market has pretty much found where it needs to be, or what I think is a reasonable compromise between the two. That being said, it's hard really to state what a clear market practice is, because depending on your fund, your relationship with investors, no two LPACs will be structured in exactly the same way. But we do see, that's a continuing trend that for governance purposes, you certainly want a strong LPAC to make sure that you can clear conflicts of interest in terms of deal allocation, but other reasons as well. But in terms of actually deciding or having your word to say on whether you want to make an investment or whether, really something that is very close to portfolio management, there we usually tend to stick to existing practice, i.e. not have the LPAC weigh in too much. They may have information or consultation rights, but we typically would not give them any actual decision rights. In a very early screening process, you may want to kind of give them veto rights in terms of overarching non-compliance with investment policy, whether they think, this is completely out of the universe of what our fund should do. That you can think about, but I think that's really how far you want to go, unless you want to start thinking about very difficult questions around liability.
Right. And on the other hand, Maria, what would you be asking for in terms of LPIC? There are apparently minority investment, but if you take a larger share, is there a standard request on your end in terms of LPIC structure?
Well, yes, definitely it is a question of the ticket size, whether we can be or can participate in the advisory committee or not. And during the signing process, it is always, we always try to be part of this board. But basically, I must say that being invested in the fund, you don't even think about that you are part of any advisory committee, especially if you're on the asset management side, you are usually invested in like a lot of funds. And this is not the operational thing that you do in your working day or during your work is participate in any advisory committees. However, we had one case, and that was a compliance issue with one GP, and we were asked, being in the advisory committee, to participate in newly set up compliance processes, such as whistleblower review and stuff like that. And that was of interest for us because that was also relevant for our reputation and for our compliance processes. So that was actually, from the compliance side, that made sense for us to be in the advisory committee.
I agree, and that leads us to another point, because that's the difference between actually being a bit more active LP and being a co-investor, right? Mm-hmm. That's a huge thing recently. I mean, it has been initiated, I think, by GE Capital, which is no longer existent as an LP and is pretty much available with GIC Private in Asia to really become a very active co-investor. Maybe, Maria, have you considered those investments alongside the fund? You know, you see one portfolio company being particularly attractive and you want to do more, want to have a higher allocation, or do you say, you know, as a family office, we are relatively big in German terms, but competing with CalPERS and others, it's not really what we would consider. What is, you know, Cara's take on co-investments altogether, maybe?
Well, being in a family office, a single family office, we are quite open to any kinds of investments, liquid, illiquid real estate, and of course also on the co-investment possibilities. The attractive thing about the co-investments is the cost side. So you usually can negotiate lower costs. However, the ticket size is usually higher than you allocate to in proportion to a fund or to a GP. So this is where you have to look at both sides of the coin. On the one hand, the saving the costs, but on the other hand, there is a higher risk that in case this investment does not perform, you can lose a lot of money. So it always depends on your relationship to the management team, how far you are in the due diligence process on the level of the portfolio, not on the fund level. So we do not rule out the co-investment opportunities, but it is really dependent on case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Interesting. And maybe two questions for Adrian. One adding up on this one, do you see, I mean, you advise apparently also US franchise with the European offerings. You advise Scandinavian-led PE funds on their European offerings. Are they really big about seeking for European and then maybe even German LPs to co-invest? Or is it more like, you know, if they were so sophisticated that they could support us with a medtech transaction, that would be fine. But, you know, they are relatively big pension fund, but we don't want to forego, you know, our remuneration for really expertise just by getting someone becoming more active and eventually hindering the performance. There were studies out, academic studies said that co-investors did worse than fund investors, to remind ourselves. So what do you see actually on your desk in terms of co-investment offerings from the GP side, and then addressing European LPs to come to the fund for such co-investments?
Yeah, I actually do see quite a lot of appetite to offer these co-invest opportunities through different ways and different means. So sometimes you have, you know, your deal-by-deal co-invest structures. We have, at least what I feel, is an increase in co-invest funds. So something that's really more systematic than just on a deal-by-deal basis. You know, what the real initiative for a sponsor to do that will vary, whether it is, indeed, as you said, financially, it will be usually a bit less interesting, but there are more strategic reasons that can certainly prompt such a product or such an offering. And I think on LP side as well, I think, you know, one is certainly gaining exposure to potential interesting assets at a time where you have a little bit more visibility. But what we often hear from from LPs is just that they also gain more insight into the actual investment process. And specifically for LPs that may be new to the asset class private equity, we do see increased interest kind of to, what they feel is take a closer look, be closer to management, value creation, and really closer to the asset. So I think there is certainly a very high level of appetite on the LP side, and GPs are very much, happy to cater to that. Regarding your second question in terms of geography of potential investors, I think it's mixed. We do have a lot of German and European institutional money that we do see going into these. I think it's also, you can't forget that the macroeconomic circumstances are obviously very conducive to making such investments, even if they may perform slightly less well than an investment in a diversified fund. They'll still perform relatively well compared to other asset classes. So that, together with diversification, I think gives sufficient incentive. And I think, again, in terms of geographies, it's really hard to pinpoint one exact geography. I think the general trend, which is not just true for these co-invests, but also for the funds, is that investors are really coming from all over the globe.
Right. Let's then, before we ask a little poll question to our audience, maybe, Maria, let's discuss side letters for a moment. There was one movement maybe 5 years ago really saying, most favored nations, we really have to become more uniform, let's serve those side letters for tax accommodation very much, get the auditing stuff right and get the data channels together, but that's not really grant, preference treatment to one particular LP. So that would be the question maybe to you and to Adrian. How did that play out over the last 1 or 2 years? And then very, very important, ESG, right? We talk a lot about ESG. How and where do we document it? Is it still about the side letter, or is this progressing really to the LPA, PPM, and so forth?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll start with the first question on the most favored nation. I would say there is definitely a process or a progress within the development of the LPAs. From my point of view, it used to be a standard that the MFN clause was within the LPA, and now I see more and more MFNs are not contained in the LPAs, and you have to proactively ask the GPs to negotiate these in the side letters. And when negotiating it in the side letter, the GPs are starting to draft or to put in some exceptions. So for example, yes, you have the possibility of getting the same rights and conditions as other LPs, provided that those conditions are not based on tax, regulatory, or other aspects, or, for example, depending on the ticket size you are investing in. So, just saying it in other words, I think the GPs are trying to customize the MFN clause and not to make it to any LP accessible. So this is actually what I can see from the LP signing process.
Right. And I agree, because we talked about co-investments. It would basically mean everyone can co-invest, right? And if you take a senior, a senior buyout fund GP in his sixth fundraising, having to offer to all 100 or more LPs co-investment rights, that wouldn't work out as well. But maybe you or maybe Adrian, the second question would be about ESG. Where do we locate the respective clauses? Is this side letter only, or is it as of now included in the subscription documents, PPM, LPA? Where do you find it, if not everywhere?
No, it's a good question. I think it's certainly a topic that's kept us busy, obviously, with the SFDR, fully entering into force in March. So I think it certainly depends on the type of categorization. Historically, a lot of ESG language was really very investor specific, and so including side letters if they had specific requirements in terms of prohibited investments or other compliance requests that a certain investor needed. typically that would have been in a side letter. Now with the SFDR, there are other disclosures to be made, pre-contractual disclosures to be made, and you could provide them in a sub-doc or maybe even in advance. What we now see is that typically goes in the PPM. I think how detailed and elaborate that language is, that the market is still trying to figure that out a little bit. In addition to that, obviously the actual sponsors or managers will have their own disclosure obligations on their websites that they will need to take care of as well. But I think the one of the tricky things that that we've been struggling with is that obviously this whole ESG initiative in Europe, but elsewhere as well, is meant to avoid to a certain extent this, the greenwashing phenomenon. And so that where people in the past confirmed to investors, yes, of course, ESG plays a role and we'll take it into consideration when making and analyzing investments. That now turns around, and the question is, well, does that kind of undertaking actually already pull you into a categorization as Article 8 or Article 9, probably not, but Article 8. And so you have these very sometimes lengthy debates on where do you want to end up and where, do you maybe need to reconsider your existing approach in terms of how you held yourself out to the market in terms of ESG positioning.
Right. And I recognize there was one, I think, originally Italian-led GP with the addition of HG Capital, a talent from Germany that was maybe one of the first ESG dedicated ESG PE funds, and more, are using this strategy. And why not? We're sometimes, I think, a bit fast with the greenwashing denominator, because everyone that tries to do well by doing good should be welcome. So it's more about the criteria and about taxonomy and disclosure ordinance coming into play. And there's a lot to do. I mean, I have a honorary position with the German Association of Institutional Investors, but I'm actually working for a bank, and now we have our ESG working group, and we discuss a little bit, and then we say, oh, taxonomy coming into play January 1st, 2022. And there's still a lot of way to go, and really, in terms of making it work, Adrian, if you look at that at AIFMD, there was a lot of things to clarify, but I think it's really more here, with not only two ordinances, then we have this rating ordinance to play, benchmarking ordinance to deal with. In Germany, we have the BMF circular that tries to interpret that. Maybe we have another BMF circular at the KVG level soon. And there's a lot of stuff and not enough time to deal with it. So is there a sort of GP panic coming up in terms of ESG accommodation, or could you really cater to those with a process for ESG focused funds, Adrian?
No, I don't think there's a panic. I think everyone's doing as good as they can given the circumstance and given the information. So I think everyone is taking this seriously, is taking a look at this on how best to approach it. Everyone in the market, I think, is aware of the fact that it's a moving target, that you still need to monitor this, and you may need some changes. Which doesn't create a panic as such. I think obviously it theoretically has a slight potential to disrupt the fundraising process if you would need to think about material changes and things like that. But I think realistically, if you monitor the developments, then you can anticipate those slight wrinkles and plan around them. So no, I don't see panic. I think the question is rather, do we or can we maybe qualify, for example, as an Article 8 fund? If so, do we need to do more? And then it obviously becomes a cost-benefit analysis. Do you really think it's a must-have for your investors, and does it justify the costs? And those are, I think, still ongoing discussions and an ongoing thought process with a lot of sponsors.
Yeah. I guess so, and that's fine. And given the C19, phase, I think the EU and EC will accommodate all willing parties, so I don't see a big issue in putting out the ESG hammer on January 1st, given that there was a delay of 15 months for most organizations. It's good, and we had several discussions today touching on the ESG thing, and everyone is quite positive about, you know, in the PEVC landscape that Europe is actually running the show, basically, and obviously not the US, being it for some Canadian Americans that play a certain role there too on the LP end. Just for another topic now, Luxembourg, you know, Adrian, maybe you can give us some ideas about recent changes that affect the fund space. I know we know Luxembourg, and I hope, Maria, you agree, is very famous for, in a positive sense, inventing structures that cater to certain situation and also catering to certain asset classes. You know, the famous Luxembourg triangle when setting up a fund really can accommodate any structure because they are specialists, right? And doesn't have so much to do with taxes, honestly, as the layman always claims, and it's really not a tax game here. So are there any recent changes you would want to make us aware of?
I think changes in terms of available structures or structuring ideas, not necessarily. I think there are ongoing discussions around how to make the existing limited partnership regime even more interesting. So since that has been introduced, I want to say recently, but it's actually already quite a while back in 2013, it's been a huge success. And I think we want to obviously maintain that success because we see the you know, the added value that has brought to both sponsors, but also to investors. And so certain features, for example, that you may only know from regulated funds, i.e. creating compartments or cells, which in other jurisdictions is also possible for non-regulated entities. I think that's something we're exploring. You know, whether that will come anytime soon, it's too early to tell. But I think other than that, for now, it's more kind of digesting the innovations that we have put in place. So for example, the RAIF in 2016, which has also proven to be a huge success. And so I think now it's really more kind of trying to take the last few years and see, okay, what can we do to make these regimes even better? But there's currently very little in specific initiatives on the table. I think the other very big matters that the legislator and regulator is dealing with is obviously the implementation of EU-wide legislation. AML, CT remains a very big topic. I think each time you think, okay, now we're fully up to speed, all of a sudden you realize, oh no, there's, you know, lots more to be done because reality is kind of quicker than legislation. So that remains an ongoing topic. You know, ESG SFDR is something that has kept us busy, and to a certain extent has also been reflected in a recent, you know, and this time it's actually a tax point in a favorable tax treatment for certain investments and sustainable investments that are available for certain types of funds. But other than that, I think it's just building on the more or less recent initiatives and to make sure that they remain attractive.
Right. So as promised, why don't we ask now in between our poll question, which is which global jurisdiction will be host to the highest number of PE and VC funds in 2025? And I think it's not so interesting who takes number one spot, I guess, but who takes number 3 spot maybe, or number 2 spot. So the choice is USA, Luxembourg, Cayman Islands, Channel Islands, the UK, Germany, France, and China, really asking our audience to give us their take on the most popular fund jurisdiction in several years from now. Maria, let's look at the ILPA principles. You know, limited partners in the area of private equity, mainly US and Canadian ones, have teamed up several years ago to really set standards in terms of documentation and in terms of investor rights. Being a German family office, how important are those ILPA rules for you? And then maybe Adrian afterwards could chime in on whether he sees more ILPA following when Nordic and Dutch investors are part of the game than compared to German LPs. I think there's a difference inside Europe. So Maria, what is your take on the ILPA principles for starters?
Well, I would say that they are very relevant for us, and this is a very helpful framework when reviewing the LPA or negotiating the terms, especially when we talk about such clauses as key person event or conflict of interest, or also the cost and fee determination. So, and these principles are also integral part of the investment memorandum that we do establish for the considerations of our investments. So I would say this is definitely a very, very helpful piece of work, and we do work a lot with it.
Oh, very, very happy to hear that, Maria. Adrian, you remember we had one of our very last in-person conferences, seminars, whatever, in Frankfurt. Was that at the beginning of last year? Oh, horrible. It was about really ILPA principles, and we had very good discussions. Maybe, I think Tarek did within the MUPET, did he do the panel on that one? Maybe he will accommodate. So it's very good, and that's the essence of it, that apparently it's gaining traction, Maria. Yeah, but Adrian, depending on your overall experience, are ILPA questions raised mainly by more Nordic or particularly Dutch LPs when it comes to negotiating a fund investment, or are German investors, in addition to Cara investment and Maria, also upping their game in terms of ILPA requests?
Yeah, well, I think, obviously ILPA historically was a very US-centric organization.
Absolutely,
I think there's still a little bit of catch up in terms of how market standard is in Europe compared to the US. Although that being said, I think it is still among certain types of investors. I would rather say in terms of typology of investor rather than of geography that would impact whether they use ILPA or not. So if you have sovereign wealth fund like organizations or very big institutional investors, they really don't have a choice. They need to consider ILPA in some way or another. I think in a lot of ways, what's set forth in the principle is something that they would have applied anyway. In terms of reporting, very much ILPA remains, the gold standard, I think, in terms of drawdown distribution notices, fee reporting. That certainly, I think a lot of people are just, using the standardized templates and reverting to best practice in ILPA. I think in other respects, we've seen less or some guidance not being adopted contrary to what we'd expected. So a lot of this guidance around subscription lines and impact on performance calculations, all of that, we don't see reflected that much in documentation, which I think if you want to interpret it optimistically, it's just that it's not conceived as such big a problem in Europe as it may be elsewhere. But that's just to a certain extent speculation on my side.
Oh, that's interesting, as you talked about subscription lines, maybe in terms of GPs, European GPs, has it progressed a little? I saw that firstly, with D.D. Sklar from New York and Wells Fargo, who was financing a lot of more infrastructure, later stage PE plays, apparently because you had a collateral base when subscription finance means you have LPs, that have committed to investments, and you say, we have the deal of our lifetime in front of us, but we're still in the process of fundraising. So we need more on the commitments. Is this growing here, or haven't you seen that lately? As you said, it's not the super European thing. What is the development in terms of subscription finance in Europe?
Well, I think in terms of, the funds that I see, I think it's hard to quantify, but it feels like it's now like 95% plus funds that use these. Indeed, I think, if you look back 5 years, then it may have been, 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 10. It's now such standard practice. I think whether it's an absolute necessity for certain funds, that can probably debate, because they may have access to bridge financing or warehousing solutions elsewhere, so that it's not a clear necessity for all of them. but it certainly, makes things easier and helps with the process. So we've seen a very big uptake in sponsors using these.
Oh, that's interesting. So I hear we have one question from the audience. So please.
Yes, we have one question. Are German fund structures good enough for international LPs?
Yes, very good question. And maybe Adrian isn't the wrong person to ask, I guess, because he has a German law degree. And given that you are asked not to discriminate, Adrian, I would reframe the question for you before asking Maria. What are actually situations in which you would recommend to consider a German structure too?
Sure. No, I think there are certainly instances where a purely German structure can make sense. I think that is where you have a very German-centric fact pattern, where you have the assets located in Germany, where you have investors or the majority of investors located in Germany, that I think it can be a very viable solution. In fairness, I think that's a little bit how the question was coined. Once you look at it from a more international perspective, once you want to diversify your investor base and also your assets, then I think very quickly, Luxembourg or certain other jurisdictions become more interesting just because of sometimes hard reasons, hard facts, which make the structure only one of the viable options, but also in terms of perception. I think, if you look to big institutional investors outside of Europe or even within Europe, all of them will have had exposure in the past to Luxembourg. And so I think there's this familiarity factor that certainly plays, even in certain instances where, from a strict legal and compliance perspective, other structuring options may be available as well.
Maria, before I hand over the KG advertising section to you, let's look at our poll results. So it's a tie between the US and Luxembourg at 57% both, so multiple answers were possible. Then it's the Cayman Island with 14%. Yes, there are feeder funds apparently for many structures. And then a little bit the Channel Islands, UK, Germany, China, all the same. France last. No one apparently would recommend to use French fund structures for international, for global fund structures. And that maybe makes sense. Maria, I guess your own structures, co-investment structures will be KGs, I trust. But when it comes maybe to interesting VC and growth funds in Germany that you look at, do you like the KG structure for simplicity?
Definitely, because we know how to handle them. We know the taxation situation. Yeah. And from my point of view, German fund structures are definitely competitive. And you do not do the stretch because if the substance, the decision maker are located in Germany, then it makes sense from my point of view to set up a German fund structure. Of course, the taxation of the management fee from the VAT point of view is not that competitive on the European level, and I hope that will change in the as soon as possible. But this is definitely can be a deal breaker when deciding where to locate your fund within which European jurisdiction.
That's true, and you raised the issue of VAT taxation, which was a long upper for Luxembourg. You know that you guys could make good use of. And again, if you look at the Fondsstandortgesetz in terms of VC management participation and so forth, there are a lot of things on the agenda. But as the BMF always says, we're not a fund jurisdiction here in Germany. And so we probably have to leave it to our friends and specialists over in Luxembourg. So for the moment, thank you, folks. Very glad to have you with us. Maria Rostock from Cara Investment, A.Aldinger from Arendt and Medernach over in Luxembourg. Had a great discussion with you on fund terms in 2021. An open agenda, so probably we'll meet next year in Munich at the Bayerischer Hof on April 28th in person. Finally, it will be about in-person events. Remember that, what that was? Thank you so much. A great discussion. Hope you enjoy the final panels of today and hope to see you soon in person again. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.